Good afternoon. I hope this shows up okay. And I made some hollyhocks in my water yesterday. Oh, it impressed me. I liked it. It made such a nice flavor. Well, today I've got a different hollyhock, the old-fashioned, not the double. I've got some lavender, which I didn't have yesterday. I still have mint. I think I might add a few lemon slices to this. But in the meantime, you might want to join me. And you know, Father's Day is coming up. And so I thought I would just spend a little time telling you about, not altogether about my father, but somewhat, and then maybe some other things on another day. But you've heard me say that, hello Maggie, that my father died when he was 84. The year before, at 83 on Mother's Day, he hemorrhaged and had to be taken to the hospital, and he had transfusions, and he was bleeding quite bad. Well, and on Mother's Day, when he was 84, again, the same thing happened, had to be rushed to the hospital, and they just were, it was almost a lost cause. You know, it was going out faster almost than it was going in. But he had the transfusions, and they finally said, well, he's anemic still, but we've got him a lot better. And they decided to operate. And for a whole year, they'd been treating him like he had prostate cancer. So they operated. The doctor said, okay, he didn't have prostate cancer. That's ruled out. So he came home, and actually he died of a blood clot from the operation. But I really think he had he did have cancer of some sort. They just didn't know where. And my father, when he was a little boy, he had a problem with cow's milk. And so I suppose in those days, mother nursed their children. And then when they went to put him on regular milk, it didn't go well. My father learned how to milk at a very early age, because when he wanted milk, he would go out and milk, and it wasn't the cow, and it wasn't the goat, and it wasn't the sheep. He drank mare's milk, and so he milked the horse, and that's what my father was raised on. I've never heard of anybody else being raised on that kind of milk, but my dad was, and it worked. My dad was, probably 6'2", big, barrel-chested, didn't have any enemies. Everybody was his friend, and a nice dad. Not perfect, but a good dad. And I have lots of nice memories. And also, my dad didn't get to finish grammar school. He had to work or do something for the family. But then he went back to high school, but then he didn't get to finish high school. Then he went back and did some college. Then he went to work at a company that finally made him an engineer. What do they call it when you are made something emeritus or something like that? Tom? Well, anyways, something like that. And they used to have meetings where the engineers would all come together, and they'd say, Mac, come to our meeting, listen to us, tell us what you think. So he'd listen, he'd ask questions or talk, listen to him talk, and when they got done, they'd say, okay, Mac, is it possible? And he'd say, whatever, he'd answer them. And they listened to him. And he was that kind of a man. Okay, but even though he was engineer type, inventor type, I'm going to tell you about his two cars. And that's what I want to tell you about. And both of them are past, but when I wrote this, one was still alive. Hey, the Blazer isn't still alive, is it, Tom?
What's that?
My dad's Blazer, it's not alive, is it? Didn't finally Craig take it to the junkyard?
You know, I just don't know.
Okay. Anyway, if it's not alive, I mean, if it's not in a junkyard, it's on somebody's ranch. Okay. But my dad claimed that his 39 Pontiac was the great-grandmother to the 1972 Blazer. Now, this is all present. I'm sorry. He now drives, which he states looks like it's been to war and lost. The Blazer has been rode hard and put to bed wet many, many times. It is a battered vehicle, but in spite of its looks, it has lots of spunk left. The grandsons think the Chevrolet company should be using it to advertise the enduring qualities and the brute strength of its product. For years, each summer, the Blazer and my father have been loading logs nearly 30 feet long by 3 feet in diameter or so. My dad did this by himself, by the way, and my mother. Those are the only two that were there. For the firewood on a low bed trailer. That's quite a feat for a 17-year-old vehicle that had never had any major repairs, and an 80-year-old man who had both hips replaced twice. Many a tale could be told for each of these trips, but this is not the Blazer's story. And my dad had it figured out how to load those by himself onto that trailer using that Blazer. Okay, the car came to us brand new. This is about now the 1939 Pontiac. The car came to us brand new when I was 3 years old. I never can remember her looking new and shiny bright, though, but rather only oxidized, nondescript, dusty tan. I remember her best when she was rather old than new. By the time I started high school, she'd lost 2 windows, a front and a back one. It made for good ventilation. Before the windows went, my brother and I suffered many a bout of car sickness. Trips were never exciting. They were only endured. The headliner was worn and torn, grayed and frayed. Portions of the liner still clung faithfully, while most had given up with a sigh and hung limp. Even the upholstery had worn away on the driver's seat, and the metal springs were showing signs of wear. The floor matting died years before, leaving the skeleton of a coarse web collecting seasons of mildews and muds. My brother and I were both ashamed and proud of her. The Pontiac, named for an Indian chief, looked like all its feathers had been plucked, old, tired, dented, and dirty. But for all her looks, she was still a plucky, gutsy lady, and we were proud of her for that. She was ours. My dad's theory was engines ran best at their peak performance. Don't lug an engine to death at slow, inefficient speeds. You put the pedal to the metal and go, and that he did. You didn't travel leisurely, you only stopped for tickets. Nothing was ever replaced on the car. I don't remember how long she went without her muffler, but I know for years you could hear her coming long before you could see her. The neighbors would say, "Sounds like Mac. Here he comes." And then he would go flying past, and the weeds along the roadside would flatten out in his wake, then flip back up with a quiver. The roar of the car would reverberate and echo. She had get up and go, but the brakes did too. They were worn out and needed pumping to make them work. My dad had it worked out to a science and took the problem in stride, but my mom never mastered the brakes. My mother wasn't one to use strong words or slang. She didn't let us say any slang. We couldn't even say shut up, which I am very glad. I didn't let my kids say that either. But at times she was trying to put when she was trying to put an end to her trip, we kids heard an occasional, and forgive me, oh hell. When my mother went to visit our Folsom grandma, my brother and I made bets how long it would take my mother's to stop and how many times around the block and which house past my grandmother's would we park. My mother would be gunning the car to get up the hill, and at the same time she needed to be pumping the brakes as she rounded the corner to the first house on the block where my grandmother lived. The closer we got to the corner, the redder her face became, and we knew we wouldn't make the first attempt. As she grew more uptight, we turned giddy with giggles and laughter, which we soon learned to suppress out of necessity. Our laughter could come later as we pictured our sweet-tempered mother, red-faced, spewing oaths, pumping with her busy feet, clutching the gear shift and the steering wheel all at the same time. My father was a mechanical engineer, near genius, but if the car couldn't be fixed with baling wire, I don't mean string, I mean baling wire, it didn't get fixed, with the exception of the time when the rear axle came loose and slid out from under her as she cornered. My dad nailed a 2x6 with 16 penny nails to the underside of her fender after the axle had been pushed back under her private place. The beam held it all snugly in place. On the outside of the fender, the only evidence of the repair job was the bright, shiny heads of the nails, and soon they rusted over to blend with the rest of the car. In 1952, after many hard miles, the end came. No longer would baling wire and beams fix her ills. She would be put to pasture. My brother and I stood to open the gates. My dad started up the old faithful car for the last time, gunned the engine, shifted the gears. She roared through the first gate and then made it through the second with mud flying. She began to cough and sputter, and with a jerk, her pace slackened. Then she stalled and died. My father jumped out, slammed the door, gave her a pat on the hood, dusted off his hands, and walked away from the 1939 Pontiac sedan. One dismal day, when we were at school, the car was hauled off in an undignified manner to rust away. None of the cars that followed, including the brand new yellow Oldsmobile 88 convertible with the blue leather seats, had her character or fame as that old car of my dad's. And so that's what I wrote about, my dad and his cars. And he had, and then I'll tell you two more vehicles. Well, he bought a 1928 Buick, and I used to always have the headlight, but I gave it to Craig. And in the headlight, one of my children in kindergarten had painted one of the pictures. One of my children, when they came home from kindergarten, I said, "What'd you do today, honey?" And he said, "Well, today I painted at the cracked table with evil paint." Translated, that meant he painted at the craft table with easel paint. But anyway, my son still has the headlight to that 1928 Buick, and he drove it to work. And by then he had to wear a suit and a tie, but later he replaced that and he went to work on his Harley Davidson, and his tie would be flying in the wind and off he'd go. And my dad drove that until he couldn't kick over the starter, and then after that they came up with electric starters, and he was so sad that he hadn't been able to have one of those that didn't take the electric starter. My dad and mom went 3 times across the United States and into Canada on a Harley Davidson. So that's the story of my dad, and I hope you have a really nice weekend with Father's Day. So, and have just a nice celebration.